and I wanted to pull you aside and talk about the topic of Pan. I know that you'd recently written this book, Mythologies of the Wild of God, and I've got a copy. I can't wait to get into it. So, link in the description, friends. You can support Mike, get a copy of that. But I wanted to sit down and ask you about the topic of Pan, because I'd recently come back across my mind. You have been speaking about him as a character, as a topic, and it seemed to be like an okay concept, which is what we do with most things. As long as it stays mythology or a fairy tale, it's like, okay, I can understand it as a metaphor, as a symbolic thing. And then I went and discovered the ROC, the founder of the Findhorn community. And I know
Yep.
little to nothing about it, except I read his book where he's communicating with fairies and elvish beings and replete with conversations directly with Pan.
Yeah.
And I was struck. So first of all, the fact that there's these conversations. Second of all, the comfort and familiarity that Pan has being a servant of Christ, being a servant of God. And hearing that, the kind of language coming from these fairy beings is interesting, delightful, challenging. And then he goes and he references Anti-Pan, who shows up
Right.
a lot more frequently when it's mistaken for. And so I just had to pull you aside because one of my first memories of ever learning about you was your articles on the Green Man. And that started turning my life around way back in the day and got me into reading all your books. How do you make sense of this? Maybe there's nothing to make sense of. How do you chew
Um,
around on this?
well, I don't know. I mean, personally, I remember being a kid and reading books on mythology, and Pan
Mm-hmm.
was always the one you liked,
Mm-hmm.
right? He didn't seem to be so testy, or mercurial as some of the other gods. And this idea of the god of the fields and flowers and the flocks,
Mm-hmm.
that's very appealing, which is the pastoral setting. And so never thought, when people would say, no, he's the devil.
Yeah, right.
Because but there's an argument out there, and I bet there's some credence to it, is saying that the reason that the devil was depicted,
Mm-hmm.
because in the Bible he's a dragon,
Mm-hmm.
right? That the reason the devil was depicted as a goat-footed god with horns
Mm-hmm.
was because Pan was the god of the commoners,
Interesting.
right, of the countryside.
Mm.
Who's not the god of the intelligentsia, or you know what I mean, or the
Mm-hmm.
people in the urban centers, even in ancient Greece.
Mm-hmm.
He was the god of the pastoral people, right?
That's
So
interesting. Makes me think of like the
much like Jesus,
Bacchanalias and.
right? Jesus, if you look at the New Testament, Jesus
Mm-hmm.
is not the god of the elites in the New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
He's the god of the common people,
Mm-hmm.
right? And of course, the elites always have to take over and tell you what it really means, right?
Right.
But so it's always been out there, as a feeling or thinking, that I never thought of much of that argument that Pan was the devil. And
Mm-hmm.
then it happened a few years ago. I was working on this book right here,
I
Sophia,
love that book. Mm-hmm.
and the chapter on Eleanor Farjeon. I was working on that. I was just, and there's this famous. I'll read it to you. This
Yeah, thank you.
from the Defectu Oraculorum, from the Decline of the Mysteries, or the Oracles, by Plutarch. And when he talks about the story that happened at the time of the crucifixion,
Mm-hmm.
right? And according to the Greek historian, I'm just reading straight from here, a sailor named Thomas heard a voice, apparently at the time of the crucifixion of Christ, which spoke to him. Thomas, are you there? When you reach Palodes, take care to proclaim that the great god Pan is dead. And Eusebius, the church historian, interpreted this. Now it's an interpretation,
Mm-hmm.
as that Pan, the god of nature of the ancient world, died when
Right.
Jesus was crucified. But there's another school of interpretation that
Mm-hmm.
says that the spiritual beings, that whoever was talking to Thomas
Mm-hmm.
at that point, saw the crucifixion and thought, oh, the great Pan is dead,
Mm-hmm.
because Pan's name means the all.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So to see Jesus die
Mm-hmm.
Zoe, the source of life, that would be terrifying if you didn't know the rest of the story, as they say.
Right. Right.
So that's part of it, and and so I was looking at that, and actually, Eleanor Farjeon, this is one of those crappy reprints. I hate them, but this is the one I could find of her Eleanor Farjeon's first book called
Hmm.
Pan Worship and Other
Yeah.
Poems,
You'd
and it's
referenced that in one
beautiful.
of your podcasts, and so I grabbed it and I read that first.
It's beautiful.
It's riveting, and
Yeah.
that's why I want to ask you, what do you do with this? It's beautiful.
Well, I think, and actually, in that same chapter on Eleanor Farjeon, in her book Trees, she
Hmm.
also talks about this Pan-like figure,
Hmm.
and for her, you can tell Pan is a cipher for Christ.
Okay.
When she mentions Pan,
Hmm.
she's really talking about Jesus,
Hmm.
right? So, and you can read that when you read it, and Eleanor Farjeon, interesting character who your listeners might not know.
Hmm.
She wrote the lyrics to one of the most famous songs of the 1960s, early 70s, "Morning Is Broken."
Okay.
She wrote those lyrics, and actually, a version of that song is in the Anglican hymnal, and
Hmm.
she's got a few others in the Anglican hymnal. And here's the thing: she wasn't a Christian until she was 70,
Wow.
and those hymns were in the Anglican hymnal when she was in her 30s and 40s.
Hmm.
So she had a real intuitive, can even say bohemian, uh, experience of Christ, and for
Hmm.
at least a part of her career that was expressed through the image of Pan.
Hmm.
And you mentioned ROC, or rocks, as they also call them, right?
Okay.
I don't know if you know, you've probably seen that famous clip from My Dinner with Andre.
Haven't seen it. No.
But there's a clip that's always floating around the internet,
Okay.
social media, where Andre Gregory is talking about meeting Rock, who
Okay.
gives him a seed of a pine tree. Goes, he says, "You live in New York, right? Get out while there's still time." And
Okay.
and Rock, in that, and I think this is important in
Hmm.
the book you were citing. He talks about anti-pan as well.
Hmm.
You know, so if there's a pan, there's an anti-pan. I think you could say that with so many. I mean, the thing is with spiritual experiences, right?
Hmm.
You don't know who you're talking to. You know,
Yeah.
yes, I'm pan. Or well, I'm an angel, sure.
Hmm.
I didn't mention fallen angel, but I am an angel.
Hmm.
So, and I think that's an important distinction. And I love when Pan is talking to Rock in that interview. He said, "I serve the God Almighty," right?
Hmm.
But you have to
Yeah.
believe it's true. You have to believe that every tradition on earth
Hmm.
has every culture on earth has a tradition of some kind of fairies or leprechauns
Hmm.
or some kind of nature spirits,
Hmm.
and they're kind of their own pope, Pan,
Yeah.
which
Okay.
is also,
Okay.
actually, there's a great moment in a book called The Little Gray Men by
Okay.
B.B., who was a British writer. I think it was published in the 1930s or 40s. And it's about these little gnomey guys, and they're the last gnomes of England. And then there's this horrible farmer who's just killing animals, you know, out of gratuitousness, you know, and the animals appeal to Pan on Midsummer's Eve, you
Hmm.
know, can you do something to help us?
Hmm.
And so it's a beautiful moment. It's a beautiful book. Um, but I think, here's the thing. So I've been thinking about this a lot. And, you know, for those of us fortunate enough to grow up in the Catholic tradition,
Hmm.
we have what happens, you have experiences, you
Hmm.
know, whether intuitive experiences, dreams, or whatever. But what happens is we have uh, a kind of a glossary of symbols that
Hmm.
helps us interpret that. And I think, like with dreams, you know, um, we can take the symbol for the reality, but really it's a system of interpretation.
Hmm.
And because you have systems of interpretation, like the part of the system of interpretation in much of Catholic theology and Catholic history is Pan's the devil,
Mhm.
right? But that's not necessarily true, I don't think,
Right. Or
right?
perhaps
But
universally.
that is an interpretive tradition,
Yeah.
just like another interpretive tradition, which has nothing to do with stuff like this.
Mhm.
That when they talk about Mary and Martha, right?
Mhm.
That that Mary is letting Martha do all the work, and Martha's complaining. Well, the interpretive tradition for that is that the contemplative life is preferred over the active life.
Right.
But that's just a interpretive tradition. That's not necessarily true. I don't
Right.
think it is. So I think the same thing with Pan.
Mhm. So we've covered, I mean, technically we've covered a lot of ground already. I want to come back and unpick just a couple of pieces here because, again, if we're talking about perhaps Pan as Christ, there's a part of me that can go, okay, that's cool. I can inappropriately dismiss that as, I don't have to worry too much about it, which is a problem in and of itself. But her poem is like this, what is it? It's not a paean. It's
It's a lament.
a lament. Thank you
Yeah.
for the loss of Pan, the desire to revive this indwelling and this awareness and
Mhm.
this participation with him in nature and so on. Um, and so, okay, that makes sense to me. Then what you said, perhaps Pan died, or the spirits intuited something massive happened at Calvary. There was a loss of something awful there, and okay, that kind of makes sense. And but then you go and you have this conversation with ROC and Pan, and it would seem Pan is in that conversation not Christ,
Oh
but a
no, I don't
servant
think
of. And so now
no,
I'm curious, what do you do with now all of these pieces? Is it a puzzle that can be coherent or
no.
okay?
I think this is my opinion. I
Yeah.
think well, put it this way: I like the idea that Pan is a servant of God Almighty,
Hmm.
right? But I
Yeah.
think when I talked about the interpretations of the great
Hmm.
Pan is dead,
Yeah.
that'll mean that means when they saw Jesus die, they thought that was the being of all nature died. What are we going to do
Hmm.
now? That's one interpret, and it's an interpretation.
Sure.
Um, I think Eleanor Farjeon is not saying Pan is Christ or Christ is
Okay.
Pan. She is using Pan as a symbol for Christ. I think.
I see. Okay. Or is
You
it
know,
Christ as Pan has been lost? Sort of the aspect, not emanation, wrong word, incarnating or presencing of Christ in the person of Pan as one of his servants that has been lost to culture, to tradition, to religious living. Is that a little closer, maybe, to what you're
well,
saying?
the reason she does it in trees,
Hmm.
she's juxtaposing. I can't remember the name of the other character, but Pan, or she never calls him Pan, but that's who it is.
Hmm.
Never calls him that. But he's like. In fact, I think I talk about it here in the chapter. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, it's Kronos, right? So Kronos is kind of very much, you know, the father god figure, but kind of like how William Blake sees it. The 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 stern father, all about calculation and things like this, right?
Hmm.
So Kronos is all about time.
Hmm.
And here's what I wrote. In her delightful little book, Trees, Farjeon acts the role of fabulous that further illuminates her point in a more joyous cadence than in pan worship. Because pan worship is a bummer, right? Ultimately, it's sad. Her story is one of an encounter with Kronos, god of time, with the hoofed one. Kronos is deadly serious, rational. Not so his interlocutor. Here's a quote from the book. Have you then found a bigger star than mine? Cried the old one in alarm. With many moons and brighter hoops of fire? What were you doing while we were raking the firmament? And Pan answers, or the hoofed one answers, dancing, old bones, dancing. And where? On earth, with man, my brother. I mean, how's that an image of Jesus, right?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And I think it's in I don't think it's the gospel, maybe it's the Gospel of Thomas, but I think in another place as well.
Hmm.
At the Last Supper, Jesus guides the apostles in a dance.
Hmm.
and it's like it's the cosmic dance, and it's kind of a beautiful moment, right? So, but I think what happens is we get stuck in our interpretive traditions,
Hmm.
and this is, I think, what Farjeon's point was. Chronos, as you could say, is the interpretive tradition, right? Whether it's the Catholic one, the Orthodox one, the secularist one,
Yeah.
I've already subscribed to this, so I have to. I'm paid up, so I have to do what they tell me to do. But it, and that's why my book's called "Mythologies of the Wild of God," because
Hmm.
C.S. Lewis, he's not a tame lion,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So we don't let we're too afraid to let God be wild.
Hmm.
We're too afraid to let God be wild. And Farjeon, I think, is making an argument on behalf of a wild God.
Hmm.
And Jesus is the wildest of wild gods. Then,
Yeah. Yeah. This, so little bit then of a segue into the Green Man. It's a topic that has become increasingly interesting to me. Malcolm Jeet, is it Jeet or Geit? I forget how to pronounce his
guy,
last name.
guy.
Geit. Okay, he's got this riveting little song that he sings about um, what is it? Christ in the fields and in the wine and in the forgotten
Mhm.
things and so on, and that he's the Green Man who's coming back. I have a it's a fantasy novel I've been trying to write for a couple of years now about meeting the Green Man again, sort of children re-engaging with the weirdness, the wildness of nature. And so this is a topic I'm always coming back to. I'm curious: is there a connection? Do you think between Pan and the Green Man? Are they different figures? Is one nested within the other, perhaps?
I don't know,
Okay.
but I would say um, both are. Well, but I actually put it this way: I think the Green Man. I think there are green men, and
Oh, I
I
see.
saw a couple one
Okay.
time.
Yeah.
So I think they are a species of being like fairies or elves or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. To poke at that just for a second, because when your description of seeing that if I remember you saying your story, it was this very slowly moving figure for like a split second in the tops of the trees, reminded me very specifically of I think how Rock would talk about these fawn creatures, or spirits that are within the trees that. What do you say? They don't bond with, or maybe they bond with them. They share life experience with them. Trying to remember, there's another author who's also part of the Findhorn community who went very scientific with a lot of this stuff. It was very interesting. I can't remember his name, Polish
Oh,
or something name.
okay.
Anyhow, so it sounds like that there's this fawn character who's not Pan, may not be the Green Man, could be one of the Green Men. It's just this fascinating panoply, this new, not pantheon, but of these spiritual lowercase g gods to
Mhm.
now be aware of.
Yeah, and I think like Lewis and Tolkien and Charles Williams, they all knew this. They
Hmm.
weren't too stuck on the doctrine of it all.
Hmm.
When people ask Tolkien if Middle Earth is a real place, of course it's a real place. I couldn't make that up about just out of my head. It's a real place, and that was actually my experience of writing that book, or at least parts of that book.
The mythologies of the Wild of God.
Yeah, it was like it started
Please say
off.
more.
My intention at the beginning of the project was to
Hmm.
write a sequence of poems that in which I kind of explored the poetic metaphysics of figures from literature and mythology that have kind of stayed with me over the years. So for my whole life, like Arthur and
Hmm.
Lancelot, Orpheus and Dionysus. But then it spread, or Caedmon. But then it spread out to, let me just see what the landscape here around my farm wants to tell me. What kind of stories are in the landscape?
Wow. Okay.
And that's when it got really weird. But it was actually the most satisfying part of the whole project.
Really?
Well, let me show you this.
Yeah.
This is this has been over my desk for 30 years at least.
Really?
It's
So it looks like a. Is it a crucifix
it's a crucifix, but it's covered. You don't see the
covered in
cross.
ivy? Yeah, the
It's
cross
covered
is
in
gone.
ivy. Talk about the Green Man, right?
Yeah, that seems like one of those inversions of the beehives where they won't cover the faces of the icons. Maybe there's a spiritual thing there, or it's a difference in the paint that's used for painting the figures. But that seems like that too.
Yeah, I've done that with the beehives, by the way. and it
Oh, really?
works.
It
Yeah.
does?
Mhm.
Oh, how cool. What do you Oh, okay. Beautiful. So you mentioned sitting with the land, meditating, contemplating the land. On my other community or another channel that I host, Legend Fiction, we did a 5 week read through of Bard Skull by Martin Shaw,
Oh yeah.
as authors to try to think with him, to understand him, and just make a mess out of Alexio Divina, done very badly. And it was fun and very interesting. Obviously, he's just riveting. So it sounds like you went in your own way on your own walkabout. Um, can you share like what did emerge that was so weird and interesting?
Um. Well, it was a weird. I mean, the kind of the if I read through the book,
Hmm.
I can see the places around, not just on our land, but we're we have 10 acres, but we're pretty much surrounded on three sides by a gigantic state wilderness area,
Wow.
and but there's a lot of places where I'll hike,
Hmm.
and so I would be sitting here right in my office, and I'd start writing, but I would put my kind of imagination
Hmm.
into the landscape, and I'll just see what's going to happen. I didn't know what was going to happen.
Hmm.
So there's one that's like a kind of Tamlin type story where this speaker of the poem goes into this place, the beech grove, and takes a mushroom which bleeds, and then he's trapped in there for 7 years. I didn't know where that was coming from, but the
Okay.
thing is, even when I look at those poems now, I mean, those I know exactly where. There's one called The Huntsman too,
Hmm.
where I can see, I mean, it's over this way. I know exactly where I was imagining, but it was a weird thing because, like like we said, with interpretive tradition. So we have an interpretive tradition of the
Hmm.
Tamlin,
Hmm.
or what that means, or or at least the imagery of it, how it happens. But there's also the wild experience of it. And what happens when you come back from the wild experience? You have to find a vocabulary to communicate it to people, and you
Hmm.
can't just start with a new language nobody knows,
Hmm.
and or that you don't know. So you have to put it into language in a way that
Hmm.
it, whereas, and then this is what poetic metaphysics is
Hmm.
that you have a kind of one foot in the left brain, one foot in the right brain,
Hmm.
where you're you have form and interpretation, but you're not thinking about that, and you're letting it be who it is. You know what I mean? And it's kind of like, as you can tell, it's hard to explain. But I think that I think that's when you see people like Rock or whomever.
Hmm.
You have to think back in the day. Thomas was much more in touch with nature than we are,
Hmm.
and I think part of contemplation. And the thing is, when that kind of contemplation is, people think sometimes that contemplation is thinking really hard, where it's really being present. It's
Hmm.
you're kind of suspended thinking. You're kind of present. You're not dreaming, right? You're
Hmm.
not awake. You're not asleep. So, and you let what's there speak to you, right? Which
Hmm.
is a great place for a poet to inhabit. And I think that's when, in fact, in the book too. There's a I saw Pan. At least I think I saw Pan out of the corner of my eye. So we have
Okay.
on our property,
Hmm.
we have a yurt that we rent out through Airbnb. And I went out there like one summer, I think it was, to check on it. And I was walking back to the house. It's not very
Hmm.
far, maybe 150 yards. I'm walking back to the house. I'm like, okay. I'm thinking about all the stuff I have to do, and I see it on the corner of my eye, and there's Pan. I went up a few more steps. I wait a minute. Right?
Wow.
And of course, when I looked again, nobody was there, but
Hmm.
he was looking, and I felt like he was warning me about something. Um, I don't know what it means, and people might, listening to this might think, I know what it means. It means you're nuts. But you know, I've
Hmm.
had similar experiences, but don't make it too big of a deal out of it.
Right. Right.
But even if it's just an imaginative experience, it's
Mhm.
not just an imaginative experience.
Right. Right. As Nate Heil loves to keep quoting, the imagination is a truth-bearing faculty.
That's right.
Um, yeah. Um, oh goodness, so many lines I want to pull on. What's the right one? Um, so one thing I'm curious about is, I think it was you in the past. You'd referenced the Fairy Census. So I think I grabbed last year's copy, and that just like, if you have no framework for how
Yeah.
to take this stuff seriously, it'll totally put you in a completely new world, and it's just brilliant. And then to read those diary entries from Rock, I'm curious, what's your read on him as a figure? I saw a photo of him, and just he looks like Tolkien's brother or
He
something.
does. He's a very proper Englishman, right?
Hmm.
You know, I think he was some kind of scientist. I don't know what it was. He doesn't seem crazy to me.
Hmm.
You know, um, and a lot of things he says sound pretty wise.
Hmm.
I will say, interesting. You mentioned the fairy census. I'm going to see if I can find it right now because France, whatever his name is. What's that guy's name? Um,
Sorry, who? Which one?
the guy who put together the fairy census.
Oh goodness, I don't remember. I think I've got
It's
it saved as a PDF on my phone here.
here. It is.
Yeah.
Francis Young. Francis
Okay.
Young. I think no, it wasn't him. Francis Young is a different guy. That's Simon something. Francis Young just came out with an announcement yesterday that he just sent to his manuscript of Fairies a history, which is due to hit in 2026.
Wow.
It was not Simon. Simon Young is the other one. Simon Young is the one who did the fairy census.
Okay.
But Francis Young is, I think he's a professor, which sounds cool. But the thing is, um, it's interesting when you talk about this. When I was teaching college, I would always use an essay by David Bentley Hart, which was a review essay of uh, what was the name of the wait, I'll tell you right now. Hold on. It's called The Secret Commonwealth. That's right.
Hmm.
Which is was a book about fairies written in the 1600s by a Scottish clergyman.
Hmm.
And when it came out, Dover came out with a cheap edition maybe 14 years ago, and David Bentley Hart, who was then working for First Things, wrote a review essay, which is a great review essay. He's a great stylist, but he proposes there. He said, it's just it's a reasonable to believe the fairies exist.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's not fanciful. It's reasonable, and
Right.
he gives out all kinds of reasons. I mean, I mean, how many cultures don't have
Right.
a lore about that kind of thing? Everybody does.
Absolutely none that I know of.
None. So all of a
Yeah.
sudden we're so smart. Well,
Hmm.
I've never dissected one. Yeah. Okay, whatever. Perhaps there are more things both in heaven and earth that are trying to.
That are in your. Yeah. Exactly.
Mhm.
Um, what you were just saying, there was a line of thinking that I wanted to chase down, which was um, it slipped my mind. Anyhow, where were you going
Well, the
with
thing
that?
is that it's an interesting that with like Simon Young,
Hmm.
Francis Young, David Hart, John Milbank.
Oh, I remembered where I was going. It was the one article that actually threw me for a loop was actually reading Rudolf Steiner, and he has this one breakdown of the secret Commonwealth in his own how would you say it, scientific spiritual
Yeah,
process, and then he describes the four different kinds and how they interact with each other and how they mediate things and collaborate with each other. And
right.
first of all, it was just riveting and beautiful because I'd grown up reading like Enid Blyton my whole childhood, and then segued into all of the myths and fairy tales of the ancient world and stuff. So to find out that there's actually very serious, I don't know, like rigorous attention that has been put to this, and then to find the fairy commonwealth or
Mhm.
the fairy census, like you mentioned, all of that seemed fine and just fascinating until these conversations directly with them, and there's these other figures as well who are they've always been there, but we just don't know what to do with them, so we keep sidelining them. People who speak with well, speak with their guardian angels. Like, okay, as Catholics, we can sort of accept that one.
But face it, most Catholics would think you were crazy if you said, "I'm
If
just
you
talking."
did say that anyway. Uh, what's the name? Oh my goodness. I'm drawing a blank on his name as well. He went into a cathedral with a friend, and they who's
Oh
used to
no,
seeing angels.
it was
Sheldrake.
Rupert Sheldrake.
Yes,
Yeah.
I love this guy as well. Fascinating guy. And he said, well, what do you see? The angels are all very sad. Well, why? It's well because they have nothing to do. Nobody's employing
Yeah.
them. Nobody's asking them to do anything. And then to read, I have to remember the name of this guy who did it. Maybe I'll just put it in the show notes. But he talks about going through these European cathedrals and being able to intuit or see the fact that the reason the bricks and the stones all stay in place is because the fairies are very happily doing their job and holding them there, keeping them
Mhm.
there. And how they continue to be so just ignored by pretty much everybody today. Um,
Well, that's what
so
William Blake was saying the same thing 200 years ago.
yeah,
That everything is conducted through spiritual agency. No less digestion or sleep.
hmm
Right. So
right,
and we pretend, or well, we do pretend. Talk about usually we talk about pretending as little children when they see fairies. We're the ones who
hmm
pretend. We pretend
hmm
that we're in control.
right, right.
we
As opposed
we
to this
pretend we can
insane
figure it
level of
out.
participation. Yeah, we're like a Venn diagram, almost of
Hmm.
how do you say, overlapping participation with all sorts of other beings from which we're able to derive this autonomy that we do have, and it's such a different. Um,
And
so I, sorry, go ahead.
no, I mean I think um, in the fairy senses, but also there's another book I have of fairy sightings. There's like a big collection, just a collection of
Hmm
stories people collected from all over the world,
hmm
and of people, and usually, not always, the people who cite these fairies are children when they do it, right?
hmm
And what happens is we're trained out of it. This is what Thomas
hmm
Traherne says this, right? We are, because of our education.
hmm
I don't know, we don't have an education uh, that nurtures the right brain,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking actually, in my daughter May, who's now 28, when she must have been 4, because my son Aiden just turned 24. He was in the stroller, and my wife was pushing them down the sidewalk where we used to live. And May suddenly said, "Mom, stop." She would not let my wife move the stroller forward. And my wife said, "What's the matter, honey?" Because she points right in front of the stroller. Those people. And she wouldn't let my wife move until those people got out of the way.
Mhm.
And what I'd forgotten all about that, but a couple of years ago at Thanksgiving, I mentioned it to the kids, and she's like, "No, that happened.
Wow.
That happened. I don't know what it was, but it happened."
Yeah. Wow. So, okay. That's then the next question that I have, because for me, this is something that feels very immediate and very real. And what I'm looking to or trying to discover now is I was not brought up in any sense of a tradition or a culture that knows how to integrate and understand and talk about these sorts of things.
Right.
It's sort of tolerated as a fantasy sort of thing, and it's like it's for children and so on. So one, it's almost it feels like starting from scratch. Two, there's a space of reverence that seems pretty obvious that needs to be maintained with this sort of thing. Even just going off of Rock's conversations with them, they're like, "Yeah, we're paying attention to you all the time. You
Yeah.
think about us. We're able to respond." It's like same way with your guardian angel and all other paraphysical, spiritual presences, persons. Is you're just they're thought away, and so it's like, better watch my thoughts and start
Yeah.
being more careful and attentive and reverent. So I'm curious, as somebody, since I get a view where you inhabit this space with a lot more experience, maybe a lot more I don't know how to say, well, experience in it.
Practice. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's more practical for you. You've been doing it for a longer time. I guess what are things that you do? Maybe mental habits as you interact or engage with the world around you. You go out, you're in it. Any habits or things that you do?
Well, the simplest one, speaking of Rudolf Steiner,
Hmm.
is what I picked up from a book by him. I was probably 23. His book is Cosmic and Human Metamorphoses. I don't even know if it's available anymore. But in that book, he talks about these three meetings. He
Hmm.
says the meeting with the Father principle in the world, he says, happens over the course of a person's life, usually around the time they're 28. He said the Spirit we meet every night when we go to sleep.
Hmm.
We can meet with the Spirit. But to meet with Christ, he said, you pay attention every day to the subtle changes in nature. And over the course of the year, this is how you meet Christ.
Hmm.
Which is, and I think that's I'm doing it. Well, I took that as a challenge when I was 23. I was like, okay, game on.
Okay.
That's what it takes. I'm going to do it. So yeah, I started paying attention, and you'd be surprised at how much that. I mean, I can't imagine not paying attention to that now.
Yeah.
But
That
but
sounds like.
also things that people
Mhm.
don't pay attention to.
Right.
I mean, that's amazing to me. How many Catholics don't know that the date of Easter is set after the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a reason for that, right? And when I hear about fixing the date of Easter, I just cringe.
What is the reason for doing that, for having that floating date that respects uh, the full moon after the first of Easter, like you said?
I don't know what
Okay.
the rationale for the fathers was, but it's been like that since the beginning.
Gotcha. Okay. So, like you're saying, that more intentional, how would you say,
Presence. That's the word.
with the way the world is, uh, and that it's not just something we tolerate or live in, but the whole thing mediates and can is also a
Right.
communicating, alive thing,
Well,
person.
well,
I
the,
don't know.
well. The word parousia, right? The Greek word
Hmm.
parousia, which is often interpreted or translated as second coming.
Hmm.
It's not what it means. It means presence, and it works both ways,
Yeah.
right? In that great song by Blind Faith, "The Presence of the Lord," right? And the Lord is present to us, but and nature is present to us, but we have to be present to nature, to the Lord,
Hmm.
right? And we're not
Hmm.
because we're too busy or whatever, right? We're too
Yeah.
distracted, and of course, we live in a hyper distracted culture right now.
Yeah.
So to learn how to be attentive or to be present to
Hmm.
things
Hmm.
is enormously healing, and,
Yeah.
it's revelatory because by being present, it's a school of wisdom in a way, but it's not like the kind of thing you're trying to acquire data points or
Hmm.
information or you know tick marks. It's
Hmm.
really just how to about cultivating a way of approaching the world that's rational. It's
Hmm.
wholesome.
Right.
When I say
Right.
rational, I don't mean using reason, but it is rational.
Hmm.
You know that you can figure it out. I mean, it just makes sense to cultivate a way of being in the world that's not insane.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, Last question, then, sort of pulling along the lines of what you were saying about sitting with the land you're on and engaging with it, contemplating it to see what it has to reveal. I think you had a conversation, maybe it was a year ago now, with someone who was talking about North America and especially the Native American tradition, and then the stories that it has, the tradition that it has with itself as a land that
Yeah,
we have not engaged with at all. We've imported Eurocentric Christianity for all of its goods and its ills, and we have no engagement with the actual stories that what the fairies and the beings here have to mediate. And I don't know. That conversation, I kid you not, it's been gnawing at me for a year because I have no idea where to go to start to want to understand, uh, how to better understand that kind of thing.
yeah.
What are you thinking of, or how do you handle that?
Well, I think in a way you could say that this continent
Hmm.
is. I mean, if you go to England, for instance, my house was built in 1860.
Oh, really?
So in England, that's a pretty new house,
Yeah.
right? But so we don't have and the thing is, England was settled
Hmm.
by people from, those places. People didn't just grow up out of the ground.
Hmm.
People moved and migrated and settled in places.
Yeah.
So if you think you're going to get to some origin myth where you find out the original people, but I think what happens is layers of culture and layers of kind of um, spirit
Hmm.
inhabit this land. So where I am, this house, my house was built by the farmer who cleared the land, and it's also on a Native American burial site.
Hmm.
And but there were a lot of French here. So the guy who built my house was German, German,
Okay.
German immigrant. So, but you have all these where I live in particular. Watershed is like a river system that we're kind of in between two watersheds, the Huron and the Grand River watersheds.
Hmm.
And so there was a lot of traffic over here between. That's why there was a burial ground here. So there was that, but that was like medieval times, that the burial ground. But then later, when came to when the French were here, they also traveled through here,
Hmm.
and the Germans settled here, but the French voyageurs traveled through.
Hmm.
And of course, you had the Native Americans who were traveling through. So you have all those layers that pile up on top of each other, and our culture is American culture is so young
Hmm.
that we don't have anything settled.
Hmm.
So that's why I was interested in seeing that what the land has to say to me. Of course, the land spoke to me in some of the image. Well, they're all images, from my Catholic and Irish background.
Hmm.
Because I can't pretend I'm not. I don't have that, right. So you have
Right.
to,
Right.
and so you know, and I think what happened would happen. You ever see the movie Pan's Labyrinth? You ever see that?
I did. Yes. Hmm.
But you know how the fairies in there, first they look like bugs, and they
Yes.
appear to the little girl, and she's like, "No, you don't look in the book." Oh, and okay, we'll change. We'll be how it is in the
Oh, I
book. So
forgot about that. Okay. Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
I think that's really insightful, and I think our consciousness has to have
Hmm.
a vocabulary of images to understand the,
Hmm.
the, the sensations or whatever's communicating to us through the world.
Right.
We have to have a way to understand it.
Wow. Well, there's an interesting sort of thought. What is the word? Ectoplasm, I think it's called. It's how
Yeah,
the beings will use the mental furniture, metaphors,
well,
myths, images that you have in your imagination to be able to communicate to you. What an interesting then thought. Where if you have nothing because you've been chronically starved of story and cultural upbringing and connection and any of those artifacts and those tools that help you articulate your interior life or multiple stories that express the world in multiple different ways. If you have nothing, it would make sense then that a lot of these beings would be unable to communicate in any way.
yeah, that's
And if they
like the
did, it would be
rainbow,
pretty terrifying because there's no context for anything.
like the sad angels who are gotten unemployed, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Wow.
And I think in that chapter with Rock, I think we're waiting, we're here.
Yeah.
So,
I'm curious if you
we'd love
then.
to help. We'd love to help.
So I'm curious then, just to then wrap up, this sense of being alive with them, living in collaboration with them. I think here's my understanding is that Findhorn was an experiment to collaborate more intentionally with these beings to produce food in places where it would be almost impossible to do. And when you go to their website, you find I didn't see any reference to this side of their mission, just the fact that look at our incredible ability to do stuff because we're in sync with the land, as opposed to the beings who presence the land and so on.
Mhm.
So I'm curious for someone like yourself, do you cultivate is a state of like collaboration with them? Is that something you do or just passively receptive
Not
to
like
it or
Findhorn. So in Findhorn, at least in the early days,
yeah,
they
again, I
were
have
getting
no context
instruction.
for where they are now or anything, so
Yeah, well, they kind of fell apart, but
okay.
the early days when it was nothing was there was no Findhorn Foundation. It was just
Okay.
these couple of crackpots, you know, and
Okay.
they had the spiritual beings were telling them, yeah, grow this here.
Mm-hmm.
But you're gonna have to. But you don't. But the thing is, people used to say about, oh, I see these vegetables are going at Findhorn. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But they're acting like they just threw seeds out the window and they just came up like Jack and the Beanstalk. But if you read the Findhorn book, I
Mm-hmm.
can't remember the guy's name, but he was the head gardener. He would go around to all the grocers and all the different brewers, and he would take all this stuff home in his car to
Okay.
compost. So he was doing
I see.
very
Okay.
practical gardening work.
Okay.
So, but I think if you do that real practical gardening work like we do here on our farm, I
Mm-hmm.
think whether they tell you what to do or don't tell you what to do, or they might tell
Mm-hmm.
you what to do intuitively,
Yeah.
I think they appreciate it,
Yes.
right? And so I think because they appreciate it, you get a little cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that creates that. It's not a catch-22. It's like a paradigm shift where it's like what is it, the duck or the bunny, depending on how you turn the picture over. Where it's like
Yeah,
they do, you nurture the ground, and so they're attracted to participating with it, or because they participated, the ground does well because they're happy with how it's being treated. Um,
yeah.
and
And
I
that
think
kind of
it's this.
intentionality makes a big difference,
Mhm. Yeah,
and on anything,
yeah,
right?
yeah, fascinating. Michael, thanks for coming on
Hey,
and
thank
just
you.
for chatting
Sorry, I
with
have
me.
laryngitis.
Oh no, I hope you get better soon. Friends or anybody who's watching, please grab a copy of Michael's latest book. It's link is in the description. You can support him. You have any courses upcoming, Mike,
I
that you're
have
running?
one that starts the beginning of March on William Blake's Jerusalem.
Okay.
Mm.
Okay. Wow. Well, I'll put a link into the description or in the
Yeah.
description for that as well, so folks can go check that out.